This is Gordon Bonan. I'm a scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado, and I'm also a bonsai practitioner. And you're listening to Bonsai Time podcast.
Welcome to the Bonsai Time podcast, the tree hugger's #1 spot for history, horticulture, and having fun. Today we have a special Earth Day episode featuring Dr. Gordon Bonan, a Colorado-based bonsai artist and climate scientist. Gordon's published work, both as an academic and an author, are diverse, but one topic of focus in his research is how our forests impact local cooling and rainfall and their role in a changing climate. We discuss both Gordon's scientific and bonsai experience to better understand how they relate and what the rest of us can learn from his perspective. And with that, bonsai on.
There we go. Okay. No, yeah, you and I met back in Todd Schlafer's class, still doing school myself. So, I'm about set to graduate next fall. So, there's that. That's always good. Horticulture degree in hand.
And you have kids too, right? Don't you?
Yeah, my daughter's now 1.5, little Juniper. Yeah. So
no, that between school, kids trying to do bonsai, you're probably pretty. Life is probably pretty crazy.
Only a little bit.
Yeah.
And this is my co-host Ryan.
Hey, Gordon. Or should we call you Dr. Bonan?
No, Gordon.
Okay. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I'm also going to OSU. I'm working on my PhD in microbiology.
Yeah, that'll keep you busy.
Yep, definitely. So I'm in my 4th year, kind of towards the beginning of the 4th year. So
okay, so I guess you're all done with classwork. It's more research now.
Yep.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Which is fun. It's fun to get the classes out of the way, but it's a different way of. It's so unstructured that like classes are very structured in terms of what you have to do to get through, and research is like completely the opposite, completely unstructured.
Yeah. My problem right now is too many side projects. Like I want to get the side projects out of the way so I can focus on the main project so I can get out of here. But I don't know how long it's going to take. We'll just play it by ear.
But you did just pass your defense or your
the candidacy.
Candidacy, so, that's right.
I know that kind of differs by department. I don't know how it was when you did your PhD, Gordon, but so for us, we do our kind of like proposal for a research project sometime after the 2nd year, between the 2nd and 3rd years. So I did that. I finished it in February of this year. So that's about the halfway point for my department.
Yeah, I don't know what they call it. I know it's different. They call it different things these days. We had like a oral and written comprehensive exams we had to do, and then we did have like a proposal defense, and then ultimately your thesis defense is sort of the stages that we had to go through.
Yep. So now I just have to do research, publish papers, and then do thesis.
Yeah, just that.
Mm-hmm. Just a couple of things.
Yeah. So simple, so simplified when you put it that way.
Yeah.
Again, Gordon, thank you. Is this your first podcast you've ever done, or just be like your amount of many interviews?
Many interviews, but none in the podcast world. They've always been more printed interviews for new reporters. There was actually a couple of NPR ones that were recorded. But this is the first, and even though podcasts have been around for a long time, this will be my first podcast.
Oh, good. I'm glad we could have you on your first ever podcast recorded. No, when I met you and I approached you with the idea of doing this, I couldn't think of a better person to talk to about the environment. Being that, you told me a little bit about your history when we were in class together, the design class in May. Mm-hmm. And, I don't know about you, but that blew my mind, the work we were doing and just all the things in consideration for bonsai and the environment we were talking about. I mean, if you recall, I and myself and the other student were taking on the journey of finding all the wood borers if you
Right,
recall,
right.
and
Yeah,
I
yeah,
found like 50 or more in one tree or something. And you know, that explanation of different climates, even for Todd's microclimate, you know, is quite extensive. Just the
yeah.
difference of how the trees were doing. So,
Yeah, actually, I sort of wish I had done that because I don't know really much about. I'm not good on um, pest insects and stuff like that. Like
mm,
integrated pest management, forget it. Like I have no
Mm.
idea. Yeah,
That's an episode we
but
want to do later.
but yeah, I really wish that was hands-on experience of sort of seeing, of identifying where the wood borers are and then how to get
mm,
them out. And I'm very fortunate that none of my trees have that. And I realized after that that's like I still don't know what to do if you actually how to find wood borers. Yeah, I think I
mm,
might be able to identify them, but then by the little holes and the you know the debris coming out of it. But
Mm.
then like how to get them out of there is like, and so you guys were really going at it with those.
yeah, it was quite the extravaganza, if you will.
Yeah, yeah.
Kevin, can you elaborate a little more? Like a lot of our listeners aren't from Colorado. Is this like a
Hmm.
Rocky Mountain problem, or is it kind of more widespread as long as you have pines in your area?
It's actually quite widespread. Significantly, there are a lot of studies going on in Oregon, just around Crater Lake, because the white pines around there are significantly impacted because it's an old growth ecosystem over there. And then with climates ever evolving, if you will, the spread of the borers and other pests are exchanging into other states and creating bigger dilemmas for those local regions and or statewide regions, to where I want to say, and I can't remember exclusively, but I believe it's all the way almost to the East Coast in certain parts, just because our winters aren't getting as cold as it used to be, especially in the Midwest, as we've been in Ohio now, exclusively to Columbus. My professors who work for the state have been telling me for the last 4 years I've been at OSU, or however long, uh, we are at a zone 7 now, exclusively for the Columbus city of Columbus and in the area within the city. And so now we can grow crepe myrtle and lots of other hemlock that we couldn't before, because with it not being a 6 or growing zone 6 or 6A or whichever have you, exclusively now is zone 7. That has changed quite a bit, especially for our snowfall. We don't get a lot either. Gordon, are you originally from Colorado, or where are you originally
No,
from?
New England. Yeah,
Oh, okay.
New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, that area
Oh, so
is
you were
where I.
used to some cold winters then.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I can live without the cold winters. Yeah, not the Minnesota cold, but just something that sort of reminds you of a change of season. Yeah,
Mm.
White Christmas, yeah, those are nice.
yeah.
With within your research, we'll get into that, but can you tell us a little background history of yourself, of where, like you just stated, you're from New England area, also there, but how did you get started, or what got you to where you're at, or what led the horse to the cart, or cart to the horse?
You mean like professionally?
Whatever
Uh,
you feel is an important
yeah,
milestone for bonsai and professionally. We're kind of interested in both today. So,
yeah.
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 Well, okay. So I think they go together
Mm,
because so what I do is I'm sort of, I guess if I had to describe myself, I would say I'm a forest ecologist. So I study forests, and my particular interest is how forests affect climate, and how by changing forests, particularly through deforestation or afforestation, we're changing climate. So it's always been sort of focused around trees. And that's I've always had this interest in bonsai too. Like the first, I guess technically, like the first bonsai I grew was I was like a teenager, and I planted this orange seed, and it grew into a tree. And it's like I was like it's like really fun, and
mm,
that was a really fun tree. We had that for a long time. My mother would take care of it when I went off to college and stuff, but it was always fun to come back home, and the tree was there, and to get to see it again. And so, there's always been an interest in trees, but it took me a long time as an undergraduate to find sort of a major that actually sort of satisfied that need.
Mm.
I went through a couple of majors before I finally settled in on a department at the University of Virginia called Environmental Sciences, and that department combined, ecology and atmospheric science and hydrology and soil science into one department. And I sort of realized, oh, finally, after years of searching, it's like, this is what I want. This was it. I finally felt home. And then I took a course in forest ecology as an undergraduate. And it's like, whoa, this is it. This is what I wanted to do. And so there's always sort of been an interest in trees that sort of manifested in discovering this field of science called ecology that studies forests. And then that led me to then like get a master's degree in forestry because I thought like if you like forests, you should see what the forestry world is like. But then that got me really interested in research. And then I went on for a PhD back in forest ecology at the University of Virginia. And then everything else as I sort of led from there. But I think what it is there's been a theme of trees and forests throughout my life, both trying to grow an orange tree from seed and seeing what happens. And I've been growing trees ever since then. And then professionally, and scientifically studying trees and forests.
Mm.
Okay, so I'm seeing the theme of forests, and one question I had about kind of your field of forest ecology, like what does a typical day look like when you're doing your job today, doing that kind of research? And then what did it look like when you were, say, in graduate school doing a similar field of research? Has it shifted in terms of what you're doing or the techniques since then?
Well, so one thing is actually a modeler. I develop models for my graduate work, it was develop models of how forests grow and how they might respond to climate in a changing climate. And that led to more what I do now, which is actually modeling forests and how they influence climate. So I'm one of I develop the climate models. So when you read about like what things are going to be like 50 or 100 years from now with our climate models, it's those models that are giving you that information. So it's not very glamorous. It's sitting in front of a computer screen all day, which I think is the other reason why I really like bonsai, because I spend all my day sort of modeling these trees and with mathematical equations. I don't do field work. And then I get to go home and I get to actually work and play with my trees, and so I get to touch them and do hands-on work. And so this is sort of, I joke around, this is my idea of field work is
Mhm.
growing bonsai. Yeah. Um,
Yeah, that's a
but,
good
but,
combo.
but in terms of some of the other things you talked, how has life change? Really the difference between graduate school and even postdoc and where I am now is, you really get involved with science because you like it, you have a passion for it, you want to do experiments, you want to learn things. And what happens over time is as you get more senior, you get more and more administrative responsibilities. There's
Mhm.
papers to review, the proposals to review, their committees to serve on, their students and staff to supervise. And you get less and less time to actually do the things that got you into science in the first place. And it's sort of I think, a dilemma that a lot of people face as they get more mature in their career. So a lot more administration and a lot less time to actually do things.
Okay. So were you doing this kind of like looking at data like weather sets or weather data sets or forestry like satellite images pretty much the whole time when you're actively doing your research like since graduate school through now, or was there ever a time when you started doing some field work?
For my master's thesis, I was interested in the spatial patterns of trees and how competition among trees and competition for light, for example, or root space and competition for water, might create spatial patterns for trees. I mapped something like it was like 12,000 trees or so. I mapped the location of 12,000 trees in a forest, and nothing came out of that. I couldn't prove anything. Um, And so that was my only foray into actual field work. As ever since then, I've been a modeler. Um, so the difference, Ryan, that you're talking about is back when I started. I got my PhD in 1988, and that was really before the era of satellite. Satellite data was just beginning to become available.
Mm.
Um, we certainly didn't have much of it. And so a lot of it was just sort of modeling and trying to find how particular forests would grow, for example, and comparing the model output to an individual forest or something like that. And what's really changed now is that with the advent of satellite data, it's so encompassing now what can be observed in terms of the biosphere that we just have a lot more spatially and temporally comprehensive data, and the data is global. So we're modeling, whereas I used to model just individual forests. My area of research actually was in the forests of Alaska, the boreal forests of Alaska around Fairbanks. But now it's global in terms of the scope of what we're doing. And a big part of that has been because of satellite data.
Hmm. Very cool.
Wow, that's a lot of work there in regards of it being global to where it was that more exclusive Alaska boreal forest. Have you noticed a difference in undertaking of there's more that you have to do now in regards of consideration for each climate zone or a climate environment, depending if you're worldwide, or how does that interact with you now in regards of information you try to
Yeah,
decipher?
yeah. So what the modeling I do now is part of our climate model, and these are global models. So they're simulating the climate of the world. They have to run at every throughout the whole world. And so I'm dealing with I particularly like forests, but you have to deal with every type of vegetation out there in the world. So even think of like sort of you want to think of like a sagebrush scrub landscape
Hmm.
in the Great Bay, Utah, Great Basin area. Well, we put that in our models. We try to model that. Then on the other extreme, you're dealing with, say the Pacific Northwest with these big sort of temperate rainforest type of forests or tropical rainforests. Um, we even, we got to figure out like what type of vegetation grows on the Tibetan Plateau because you can't model the
Hmm.
world without modeling climate without modeling all locations in the world. And so, it's been much more extensive now, much broader in terms of understanding vegetation, although forests are still my particular interest.
All right, that's a lot there. Wow, that's a quite impactful. I mean, knowing what you know now, how do you feel like you've given back to science and the community? Do you feel pretty great about the research you've done and helping the world?
Yeah, it's again, I've been in this field long enough that not only did we go from sort of very limited satellite data to extensive satellite data, we've gone from very uh, limited climate models in terms of what they could actually do to
Hmm.
much more comprehensive climate models. And so these climate models have always been very good at sort of dealing with atmosphere physics and dynamics. And to solve those equations of atmosphere physics and dynamics, you have to know certain things about the land. You have to know evapotranspiration, for example. Uh, you have to know what we call albedo, which is the amount of radiation that's reflected off the surface. You have to know how much heat is sort of stored on the land. You have to know the temperature of the land. And what the climate models originally did is they just prescribed that as sort of what we call boundary conditions. They said that's really not important. They need it for the model, but they just sort of prescribe it and make it as simple as they can. What we have now is we have much more comprehensive models of the world's vegetation and soils and how that affects climate. So we're dealing with things like in our models now, we'll deal with the infiltration of water into the soil, the runoff of water over the surface, because that affects how wet the soils are. How wet the soils are affects how much water can evaporate. How much water evaporates affects how cool the surface is.
Hmm.
The water in the atmosphere affects the moisture and clouds in the atmosphere. And so we've gone to really comprehensive models where there are a lot of ecological and hydrologic processes that influence climate. And so what I would say, what's been really satisfying and is really fun to me is actually to live that transition, to lead that transition, to be a part of it and realize now that when we talk about climate, it's no longer physical meteorology that we're talking about. We're talking about the vegetation, the soils, the ecology of the land surface, the hydrology, and the importance of those for climate. And so we've gone actually from what we consider sort of called climate models to now what we call this idea of the Earth system, which is the Earth is understood as this interacting system. If you want to think of it as spheres, it's you have the biosphere and hydrosphere and atmosphere and geosphere. And those spheres interact with one another. And we're trying to model all elements. Climate can only be understood by modeling all aspects of that, because all aspects of it interact and determine our climate. So to me, it's been really fun to see how climate science has changed from this very narrow view of physical processes to now realizing the biology and ecology is just as important as these physical processes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's really amazing. Sorry, real quick, Ryan, just
Mm.
with what you were just saying there of all the spheres, being that I'm in school for horticulture, there's so much that I was just like, oh, we just touched on that, all those things in relation to what my teachers have told me that even in the last 20 years, horticulture has changed due to those dynamics of what you just discussed in relation to your modeling. So I thank you for that in relation to plant sciences
Yeah.
getting more adept to the now.
Well,
So,
here's a fun thing. We modeled the oxygen content of soil because the oxygen content of soil is really important for microbial activity and for.
hmm,
So one of the things that's in the models is actually the carbon cycle and how much carbon is stored on in ecosystems and how does that change as climate warms, for example. But anyways, to do that, you have to know the oxygen content of the soil. So we actually have equations that will model the diffusion of oxygen in the soil, but also the production of oxygen by roots. So there's like a horticultural principle that shows up in a global climate model.
Hmm.
awesome.
The modeling is kind of like a mind-blowingly complex area in a way because you're talking about Earth systems and there's so many little things going on inside that could be a variable to consider. So I was wondering if we could take a step back a little bit. And I know everyone in this call is interested in science communication. You've written some books that are kind of geared towards the general public. So I was hoping we could explain a little bit for the audience, like what types of data points do we have that support the predictive ability of these models, and then what type of uses do these models have? Like, what would be the significance of this kind of work?
Yeah, so for testing of the models, they're really again, this is sort of that wealth, the growth of big data. Not only is it satellite data that's providing information, but it's observational data that has become global in scale. So that one of the standard things that these models are evaluated against is just sort of the historical record of temperature. We have really good reconstructions of temperature throughout the world for the past over 150 years. Yeah, beginning like in 1850 and earlier, we know what the temperature of the planet was. And we know it both for individual locations throughout the world, but then also for the planetary average. And so that is a really a big comparison of the models is how well are they actually simulate. So let me back up. A typical simulation that we'll do we'll be simulating climate, uh, and the resolution of the spatial resolution of the model is 1 degree in latitude and longitude, which is about 100 kilometers by 100 kilometers. We do that globally. The time step, these equations are solved every 30 minutes. And then there's also a vertical resolution, both in the atmosphere of about, like, say, 60 layers or so, and in the ocean of a comparable number of layers. And we're solving over this grid point, 1 degree by 1 degree by, say, 120 vertical levels at 30 minutes. We're actually solving the equations and doing a simulation from 1850 to present day to simulate what the climate is. And then one of the things we compare it to is this observational temperature record. And the models do a really good job at that. There's a lot of variability in that record. There are periods of warming and cooling. We understand why that warming and cooling has occurred, and the models get it really well. But then there's also lots of satellite data, measurements of the water vapor in the atmosphere by satellites. You can actually measure temperature throughout the atmosphere. Um, there are concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that could be measured. All these things are used to compare the model back to the observations. There are lots of satellite measurements of the amount of radiation, both at the top of the atmosphere, at the bottom of the atmosphere, reaching the surface, how much radiation is absorbed by the atmosphere. We compare to that, clouds, wind speeds. And then in the oceans, great measurements of surface temperature in the oceans, but also circulations in the ocean, of ocean circulation and atmospheric circulation. All these things are measured and understood. And that's what the models do and calculate. And we compare those to the observations. So they're like really extensively tested in terms of what they're doing.
That's a lot to unpack there, just in relation to
Yeah,
how
there's
much
a lot going on
history
there.
of the world there is in that. Within that,
Yeah.
not to jump off too far, but how does this, with how much time you spend in this dynamic approach to the worldwide view you have of the Earth and the complexities of environments and ecosystems, how does that intertwine with your own personal bonsai practice? Like, do you see yourself more in an integrated management system of soils to pests to health, or does it impact you in a different way that would be not the same way for other people not in your line of work?
Yeah, okay. So there's some basic stuff, that I think, in terms of, as an ecologist, I know how trees grow. I know, about water and plant nutrition. I know a lot about the physiology of things, plants and stuff like that. So I think there's that practical side of it, which is I sort of know like how trees grow, and so I know how to replicate that in the container of a bonsai container. But I think the bigger thing of it is that science, to me, I think is more of an aesthetic for how I approach bonsai, and what I will freely admit, and I probably talked to you about this, Kevin, during our class. I'm not an artist at all. I believe there's like an art gene, and I did not get that art gene. I got the math and science gene. I didn't get the art gene. And in terms of, I remember we were working on, Kevin, we were working on uh, a juniper tree,
The big
and you
one,
were sort of
yeah,
shape,
yeah.
yeah, the big one, and you were shaping it and putting branches in the right locations, and like I was just watching you, like, how do you even know where to put this branch and stuff like that? And I'm afraid that visualization is not something I'm really good at, so I can't really
Mm.
imagine what the tree would look like. Um, but science. So I am approaching my bonsai in my collection more from an aesthetic, a science aesthetic, which is like these trees are just really, to me, an expression of the natural world in
Mm.
the environment, and I see them. I value them for that reason alone. They remind me of like why I go and sit in front of a computer screen and try to solve these problems of, can we do anything about climate change? And and you come home and you see your trees and you got to water them and you got to take care of them, and it's just really satisfying. I think I also like to think of these as sort of like heritage trees,
Mm.
but not in the sense of like a really old tree that's been taken care of for 100 or 200 years, but heritage trees in the sense of like we're losing some of these trees, these species now, and they remind me of sort of what's at stake. And I think maybe like a fun example of that is I have two American chestnut trees, and these are like really spindly little. I've had them for like 10 years now. These are like real spindly little things. They're never going to win any awards or anything like that, but the foliage on them is really pretty. It's
Mm.
just chestnut leaves are really distinctive in terms of how long they are and the serrated edges on them. And I just really love looking at those because, of course, chestnut disappeared from forests, Uh, 75 years. Well, the blight actually started coming in the 1930s, and so we've been without chestnuts for close to 100 years now, and the eastern forests are just completely different without chestnuts in it. And so to me, it's fun to be able to grow a chestnut, and I like them for that reason because, okay, this was a tree that used to thrive in the US. And hopefully it's coming, there's some indications that it might be coming, that genetically they might be able to get some forms of it that are resistant to blight. But
Yeah,
I have my
yeah.
own two little chestnut trees, and that's fun.
Yeah, it was just something to add on to the chestnut you're talking about, similar to the ash, right? Ash borer and everything
Yeah.
else too, being introduced from other places, sadly, but such is the way of the world. With your discussion, just as you're saying, with the experiments with the chestnut now, I have a teacher that I started out with for biology. He's in charge. He's on the board for the American Chestnut Society, or the American. I think that's what it's called.
Ohio
Uh,
chapter. Yeah.
yeah, the
Yeah.
Ohio chapter. Yeah, and he is really good friends with the people who are doing experiments to see if they can create a genetically modified seed to combat the blight. And so I went out in the field and got all dirty and everything. We went collecting, and it was just an interesting process to see that you have them. And Ryan and I have also discussed trying to get miniature ones here. I've got American elm. He's got some ash that he's collected out of the field here and other things too. And so it's just that dynamic, like you're talking about. The trees that are lost are still coming back, but if we can make them miniaturized, they may live on longer and be more protected, right?
Yeah, it's just a way of sort of respecting the chestnut tree. And
Hmm.
these are, to my knowledge, these are actually real American Castanea dentata. I got them from a nursery in Washington State. I don't think they were genetic. I don't think they were. I mean, there are a lot of different sort of varieties of chestnut that actually more are hybrids and stuff like that. To my
Hmm.
knowledge, these are real pure chestnuts. And they're doing okay. I've had them for like 10 years. But yeah, I've read great things about the work that's going on to actually bring back the chestnut. And to me, that's like really exciting that kind. And I think it sounds like they're having really good success with it.
Mhm.
As of recent, yeah, that's what I've heard.
Yeah.
Now, a word from our sponsor.
This episode is brought to you by the Columbus Bonsai Society. As with all local bonsai clubs, we are focused on providing education, outreach, and a local community to enjoy bonsai together in Central Ohio. Join us for our monthly meetings, annual wild, invasive, and native bonsai club digs, and our annual show, which this year takes place on July 20th through 21st at the Agriculture Administration Building of Chadwick Arboretum on the Ohio State University campus. Find more information and connect with us at columbusbonsai.org and on our YouTube channel, Facebook group, and Discord chat. Now, back to the Bonsai Time podcast. Yeah, I just started learning about American chestnut more in depth, like in the past year. I grew up in Ohio, but never heard of them very much. I knew some of the native species back then, but I got much more deep into trees and bonsai when I was in Seattle. But so in the past year, after Kevin did that uh, chestnut seed collecting trip, I don't know what set me off, but I kind of went down the rabbit hole with the American Chestnut Society. And there was a guy in a Facebook group who was sharing some seeds that he had collected with people that were doing research on chestnuts. So I was like, oh yeah, I'm a grad student. I'll do some research on them, see if they can work for bonsai, if we can avoid them getting the blight by keeping them miniature. Because for the emerald ash borer, if they're small enough, they don't attract the insect. So anyways, I was wondering, how has your experience been with those American chestnut bonsai? Like, is there any nuance to training them, or how they like their roots pruned or anything like that?
I did. So I have two of them. I did try to train one of them, and it did not seem to like that. In terms of actually wiring the branches and things like that, it
Mm.
just did not. The branches didn't die back, but it didn't put on growth for a couple of years. And I don't know if there's anything. The other one that I have is now that's a smaller one. The other one I have now is much taller. It is probably 3 feet tall now, but the trunk is only say not even an inch in diameter. So, yeah, these are tall, spindly things. But that one's doing much better, and I've never trained that. I did actually finally this year prune off some branches to try to make the branching structure more interesting on it. We'll see how it responds to that, but definitely wiring and trying to actually put the branches in particular locations. It didn't seem to like that. But this is the thing. My sample size is one, or
Yeah.
actually, I have two. One that I wired and one that I didn't. So it's not a very big sample size at
Yeah.
all.
That's the
I
problem
gotta
with the nearly extinct tree species. You don't get a lot to try it out on. But this is maybe if anyone else out there listening has American chestnut seeds that they're using for bonsai, they can send us an email and we can do an episode about that in the future. Maybe we can crowdsource citizen science this. But yeah, that's very cool.
There's always that old adage too, some of the best bonsai trees or anything really is in those backyards of people that you don't know about,
Mhm.
whether it be an old cool car or what have you. It's like, oh yeah, they've been doing it for years, just not in the public eye because they don't care about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. The thing that I was worried about for American chestnut, and we're kind of on a tangent here, but they're, I think that they're closely related to beeches because the leaves are quite similar to the
Mhm.
beech and the hornbeam. So, and I've had some experience digging beech here, and you kind of have to dig them at just the right time. Otherwise, they don't really like being moved, is what I've seen. So I was wondering if that may apply to chestnuts also, but
Yeah, so my stuff was nursery stock that I got from a place in Washington State, and I haven't. Yeah, I don't really go in. They're small enough now that I sort of all I'm doing is sort of putting them into bigger containers. I'm not really doing big root pruning, and in
mhm,
fact, that's actually a question I don't know the answer to. But I think I don't no, certainly I've never seen chestnut as bonsai. So my impression is that probably what I will do is not do a classic bonsai on it. I will just keep putting them into bigger pots, every few years or so, and let them just sort of grow as big as they want to, and
mhm.
try to sort of cut back some branches to make it look a little bit more interesting.
Yeah, you could make it like a Milwaukee, like a Japanese styled landscape tree if you don't want to keep it super small for bonsai and maybe get some interesting branch structures on a bigger scale that way.
Yeah,
But
that's
uh,
actually sort of the plan, is to do something like that. Just let it keep growing, and make it more of. It won't go in the back. Obviously, it's not going outside. I keep it inside in the garage in the wintertime and stuff like that. But you can
mhm.
still grow pretty big trees, and you can get some pretty big pots to put them in.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. Uh,
Gordon, as you and I met obviously in May in Todd's class, it got me thinking, as busy as you are with your science and your modeling, how often are you available to do bonsai classes? Was that your first one, or you've done a lot before, or is it kind of hard just with your day to day?
Well, I so first, let me explain my bonsai experience, which is mostly growing. What is it? Sticks in pots. Is that the expression? The
Right, right.
it's a good starting point. Yeah.
Yeah.
because that's sort of what I thought bonsai was. And so I told you I've been growing trees, ever since I was a teenager. And mostly what I'm growing is I would go collect seeds and try to grow them and stuff like that. Or I would find nursery stock, small nursery stock, and try to grow that, thinking that if you get it really, it's really small, you can grow it and shape it, and as it grows along. Um, the idea of big trees, Yamadori type trees, I wasn't aware of at all. Ryan, you mentioned you're from Washington. You were in Seattle.
Yep.
Yeah, what really changed my bonsai experience and my thinking on bonsai was uh, actually it was only 4 years. It was 4 years ago. I was visiting University of Washington for an extended period of time. So I went to the Pacific Bonsai Museum,
Hmm.
and
4 years
to see,
ago, I
yeah,
might have been there back then.
yeah. This was in May of what would have been, if I'm doing the math, May of 2019.
Hmm.
I was there, and I went to the Pacific bonds, and that really changed my whole experience. And I realized, oh yeah, okay, it's been fun to collect seeds and grow them and see what happens, and to grow my little my nursery stock, and but nothing. I'm going to be honest, nothing ever really came out of those trees, you know. And then all of a sudden, discovered Yamadori, and then I got really serious about it, and that's how, yeah, then Kevin, that's how I met Todd Schleifer at First
Mm,
Branch Bonsai. The Rocky Mountain Bonsai Society in Colorado is an excellent uh, source of information.
yeah.
There's Hal Sasaki in Colorado is also sort of another, there. Colorado has a really good bonsai knowledge and
Mhm.
groups. And I sort of realized, like, wow, I've been growing all these little trees for 25, 30 years, my little sticks. And I never realized that all around me were these people who knew all this information, and really knew how to work with trees and really had some high quality trees to work with. And so that really changed my perception of what bonsai is.
Did you ever go hiking in Colorado and find like naturally stunted trees before you knew that those could be taken out to be bonsai?
Yeah, I never knew you could do that.
Oh, okay.
In fact, uh, I'm also used to like trees that grow in landscapes or something that might have like a deep root system. And so I sort of knew, okay, you're not going to just sort of dig up a tree because the roots are really deep. Yeah.
Mm.
And this idea that you actually go out, you're out in the wild, and you're looking for rock outcrops with shallow soil, and that's where you're getting your trees from. I That thought never would have occurred to me, that you could actually do that. And so that was like a real life. I don't do that. My idea of collecting is to go to Todd Schleifer's, because he has such good quality stuff. But it's also, but I really respect the people who have the knowledge to go out in the field to do it. And I had the opportunity to do it once with the Rocky Mountain Bonsai Society, and did get two ponderosa pines. And that was just like a real eye-opening experience to see how that's done.
Yeah,
How did
that's
they, oh, I was
Oh,
gonna ask, like, how did they organize that trip? Um, I guess maybe on national forest lands, and was there someone who had been to that spot before, or they just kind of went
yeah.
scouting a new area?
No, it was something, it was done by the Rocky Mountain Bonsai Society. And unfortunately, only, I think it was four of us got to go on it. And it was done by lottery. And I was fortunate to
Ah.
have my name chosen. But yeah, but it was led by society members. And it was an area on, I think it was definitely public land. I guess it must have been Forest Service land,
Mm.
but it's an area that had been, unfortunately, it also been picked over very heavily. But it also, I would say, it was not. I showed up for that expecting that we would go for like a 10-mile hike in the wood to find trees and stuff like that. And what we were
Mhm.
really doing, so I had this huge backpack, and stuff like that, lots of bottles of water. I was ready for a big expedition. And what we really did is we just sort of walked along an old Forest Service road, and sort of, I don't think we ever got more than 200 yards away from the road or something like that. But that's okay because we were all novices and we didn't know what we were doing. My
Yeah.
idea of hiking to high elevation in the Rocky Mountains to find, really old bristlecone pine, or uh, pine, Pinus flexus, is it
Limber,
was
right?
yeah. So thank you. Yeah, this
yeah.
Mm.
was a limber pine. Yeah, yeah, that wasn't going to happen. That was sort of beyond I had unrealistic expectations.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's
those
funny.
high
It's
altitude logging roads are kind of like the gold mine. Although you can do what you're describing, where you go on a long hike, but then you got to carry that tree all the way back to the car.
Yeah, well,
mm.
that's why I had a big backpack, as
Yeah.
I was ready to carry a big tree out of there.
Mm.
So, anyways,
No,
that was a fun experience. Yeah, to do. I think, yeah, it really, again, it helps you appreciate the trees. And
Mm.
yeah, it's one thing to go get a collected Yamadori tree. It's another, from somebody, but it's another to actually see, to do it yourself and just realize, wow, that's a major undertaking. And you don't do it unless you know what you're doing. Yeah.
Yeah, seasonally dependent as well. Um,
Yeah, I mean, that's just the nuances of it. Yeah. Mhm.
have you been able to introduce this fascination for trees in miniature to any of your colleagues or anybody you've talked to through your work?
No, no, actually, no, I haven't. I haven't really talked to people about this. It's sort of just something I like to do
Hmm.
on for myself. Yeah, as a way. One of the so my first so after I got back from visiting the Pacific Bonsai Museum, I started looking for what to do in Colorado, and that's where I met Hal Sasaki, and he
Hmm.
offered classes, and I took a couple of classes with him, but that was just real basic introductory stuff.
Hmm.
Actually wasn't even working with trees. We were like jade plants, stuff like that. But I had fun conversations with him about, and one of them was how just coming home after work and just watering your trees, how important that is to de-stress. That's a way of de-stressing. And he talked, it's like he understood it. He knew exactly what I was talking about. And he said the only reason his attitudes have changed on that is because does, I think he actually worked in finances or something like that. Uh,
Hmm.
and he would come home and then need to de-stress. And then once he got into bonsais for profession, he didn't need to de-stress anymore. And I thought that was just so nice way of thinking about it because that was sort of why I grow my trees is like I need to come home from work and find a way of de-stressing. And so anyway, so yeah, so it's sort of my own thing that I do to de-stress after a long day of work.
It's funny you mentioned that with Harold. I've never met this gentleman. I've heard a lot of stories about him, as I know Colorado is full of a lot of history with many different outlets, whether it be bonsai to Japanese culture to what have you. But there's a mutual friend of ours by the name of Chase Rosade. I would be surprised if he didn't know or have something to do with Harold at one point in his career, as Chase has been doing bonsai since the 60s full time, pretty much.
Mhm.
And there's something he always says to me, but always just comes back. It's like, I've never worked a day in my life because I've always played. I've always had fun and I've never been this stressed. I was like, oh, yep, that does make sense, in relation to what you just stated. Yeah, it's just a full circle of, yeah, when we reconnect with nature, we go back into that humble feeling of, oh, I'm okay.
Yeah, there really is something about it. Okay, so you guys probably the idea concept of forest bathing and stuff like that,
Yeah, yeah.
which is really just a way of saying you like to go for hikes and stuff like that. But my backyard is my forest bath. That's the purpose it's serving for me. When
So
you
you,
don't have yeah
so you have a tub and then fill it with leaves and kind of sitting in and roll around.
yeah yeah
My dog likes to
No.
do that too.
No. Yeah, it's pretty amazing just in the work that you've talked about just now. Ryan and I have our own experiences in dealing with our own ecosystems in regards to how we can help create a better understanding of what's changing and what's going to be different for the future of my daughter's generations or future generations past. Is what are you finding that is a consistent thing that hasn't changed in your research, that's
that
been the
that
same, that hasn't changed drastically or has just been kind of steady all the way through? Because I'm sure there's are those peaks and valleys where there's like this major change from 1850 on, right? But is there one or a couple things that have been pretty steady all the way through?
No, so I'm gonna answer that in terms of like how the environment is changing and how climate is changing is the way I want to answer that. And like
Yeah.
no, and no, and in fact, actually, the surprising thing is the rapidity, the fastness with which change is happening.
Hmm.
I think if even 10 years ago, if if you talk to most people, they would say that the major impacts of climate change or that climate change really isn't going to be experienced to the extent that people can really notice it for 50 years out, even late in the 21st century. So maybe like say around 2050, 2060, 2070 is when people would really start really beginning to notice it. I think what's happened in the past few years, we've really seen dramatic changes and the speed at which those changes are occurring, I think, has shocked a lot of people. So this idea that climate change is something that's going to happen in the future is no, it is now, and we're seeing that particularly in the West with, wildfires.
Hmm.
But you guys are seeing it too, with the smoke pollution and stuff like that. Smoke in the past few years, smoke from wildfires is now a national problem. And particularly this past summer with the fires from Canada. The parts of Chicago, the Midwest, and even the East Coast, New York, that area, we're just getting covered with smoke in ways that are sort of apocalyptic looking.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
you know,
That was
you know,
not to interrupt, but me being originally from Oregon, I was used to having summers where it's like, okay, there's going to be fires, there's going to be this. And then moving to Ohio, oh, there's not much of that. But this summer, as I have my own landscape company, so much smoke just pummeled the work site I was on in this farm, turning it into a kind of reforested project with the client. And like as you were saying, it was really weird because I would come home and like, that isn't normal.
yeah,
That is
yeah.
weird.
No, you're right. I mean, and this is true in Colorado. You expect forest fires, and we know that, but they've always been more localized. And occasionally you would smell smoke, but you would just sort of smell it. But
Right.
now what we're really seeing in Colorado is we're getting a lot of the smoke from California fires. And so when a couple of years ago, the summer was actually particularly a large fire season in California, and we got lots of smoke in Colorado. One day, actually, ash was just dropping from the sky, um, because there was so much of it. And so what you're realizing now is wildfires aren't just sort of this local issue; they're becoming sort of a national issue, and everybody. Uh, you may be far away from where the wildfires are burning, but you're going to be impacted by them in terms of air quality.
Yeah, that was significant because I would come home, and I would shower. I would just still smell it. And then I was like, oh, I'm coughing up some black stuff, just how thick it was. I didn't expect the weather to change that quickly and the air quality to be that bad that day, but it just kept getting worse in some days. And it seemed whenever I went to that job site 30 minutes out of the city, it was always just, oh, here's the smoke again. Oh,
Yeah,
it's worse today. I was like,
yeah,
oh, okay,
yeah. But what
So,
we're also saying,
oh, go ahead.
oh, no, I was going to say locally, in terms of a bonsai practice, I'm seeing things too, in that, God, right now, it's for the past week, it's been in the mid 60s, 70s during the days. At night, it's still in the 50s. And this is the middle of November, in Colorado. And so what I'm seeing is sort of a longer extension of fall, or we're seeing sort of a shift. Maybe things are shifting like a month, so that September is actually still a really hot month for us. September into October are very hot months for us. The fall is the warm temperatures are extending well into late fall, into maybe even now early winter.
Hmm.
And so that then affects your idea of like, when do you do things with your trees? How do you store them for the winter? When do you store them from the winter? I
Mhm.
had sort of put some of my trees away because we had a frost in mid to end of October. So I said, okay, so this is it. The trees are shutting down. It's time to put them away. For the winter, but I actually brought them out. I finally brought them out because we've just had too long of a hot spell. And I decided it's better to let them be outside and at least getting some good sunlight.
Mhm.
They shouldn't be growing right now. These are
Yeah.
all conifers, so they shouldn't be growing or anything like that. But I thought, okay, just keep them in a sort of an outdoor environment until the cold weather comes back in. Now, horticultural, this is interesting. Horticulturally, is that the right thing to do? It just seemed to me intuitively it was the right thing to do. But
Uh,
this is where
yeah.
bonsai really tests your knowledge of, how trees work and stuff like that.
Well, I was just gonna say I have a cold frame greenhouse shelter I have used for the last 4 or 5 years now, and being that I'm not originally from Ohio, I've always had to kind of how do I gauge the season and what I think is going to happen? It hasn't been the same, and everyone I've talked to has lived here the whole life. Ryan can attest to this that it's not the same winters they've had even from 5 years ago. The snow levels have been less, but like you were saying, these heat spells, we've only been hitting lows here of like not even below freezing most nights.
Mhm.
And so most days, like this week, we're at up to 60s in some of them, to where
Mhm.
inside the cold frame it gets up to almost 70. So I'm like, you telling me that, I'm like, yeah, I got to take mine out too and just let them kind of acclimate as they will, because I know December will be that straight heavy drop of just cold. But until it starts
Well,
getting that time of like consistent below 40 every day, that's when you got to kind of worry in regards of like freeze thaw, especially if it's a quick freeze like you guys get out there, where it
right.
can
Yeah.
be overnight, right?
Yeah, no,
And
that's what we got to watch out. Will happen at some point. We'll drop down immediately to 20 degrees or even 10 or 15. And are your trees ready for that? In the fortunately I have some nice places where I can store trees that will protect them from those really cold extremes. But you sort of want to help prepare your tree to get ready for that.
Mhm.
yeah,
And
yeah.
yeah, and I think we're not finding those consistent nights of temperatures of daytime temperatures, say getting into the mid 40s or something like that, but nighttime dropping down to like just about freezing or so, which is
Mhm.
then telling the tree, okay, I'm done.
Yeah.
We're either having extreme heat or extreme cold, which then is not very helpful for your trees at all.
Well, and throw on the stress too, as you were just stating, with the idea of insulated smoke from the forest fires. I had trees, my maples, that turned a fall color in July, just because the density of the smoke was so heavy. Like it created that own atmosphere for it to be like, oh, it's this different kind of time.
Mhm.
And since July to now, even the colors have gotten more vibrant and just beautiful. But it's that notion where, oh, there was a lot of stress. There was a lot of stress with the animals, whether it be squirrels or whatnot. They weren't acting the same either. Is that the same for you and your trees and your microclimate that you're at?
Yeah, you always sort of are being concerned about these fluctuations. Um, you know, um, yeah, I would just say, you just you're really worried. Okay, so I talked about bonsai as being a way of de-stressing and stuff like that from
Yeah,
work,
yeah,
but
yeah,
on the other hand, there's a lot of anxiety, in terms of
yeah,
Mhm.
growing trees because you like your trees,
yeah.
yeah, and so you worry about them.
They're like family in some parts. Like, oh man.
Yeah, yeah.
So in Colorado, I don't know how many years you've been there, but in the past, has it been like a much more sudden and stable drop into winter compared to what you're seeing now with kind of it being cold and then going back to warm? Because Ohio's always been kind of up and down. Like we get some pretty big temperature swings in fall and even during winter itself.
Yeah, we get big temperature swings, but and it's not uncommon to see in January, a day with high temperatures, a bright sunny day with temperatures in the 70s or something
Oh,
like
wow.
that. But individual days like that aren't going to do anything, aren't going to mess up your trees, aren't going to confuse them. But it's what we're seeing now, particularly in the autumn, the fall, is much more fluctuations of you'll get these cold spells coming in. Well, let me back up. In Colorado, it can snow anytime between mid-September to mid-May. So that's a really harsh environment for trees to begin with.
Mm,
Um, but I think layered on top of that now has been a lot more sort of rapid fluctuations and extreme fluctuations.
Hmm.
And they're not just sort of short spells. We've been in this prolonged warm spell for probably about 3 weeks now. A warm spell to me meaning like we're getting temperatures in the 60s and 70s at the end of October into mid-November, and that's like
Right.
no, you know. And again, and this is sort of what I say when I think about trees, my science aesthetic for trees. Okay, I can help my bonsais get through that, because I have places to put them and I can
Hmm.
watch out for them. But then I look at the landscape trees around and realize how are these trees dealing with type of these type of fluctuations? How are the forest and the Rocky Mountains how are they dealing with these type of fluctuations? And they make you sort of realize that, yeah, that the change in climate is having an impact.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, especially with the landscape trees might be our biggest and quickest way to see those changes because it's also being affected how it's being in that microclimate of itself as opposed to a forested area, right? Because you have these individual trees sometimes in a city landscape where, oh, that's doing that. Well, how is it going to do that in a larger, more dense setting, right?
Oh yeah, yeah. I think what you're saying there in the landscape, they're exposed to a lot of extremes to begin. It's extreme, harsh environment to begin
Yeah.
with.
Yeah.
Like in an urban landscape or even
Hmm.
suburban. It's not like they're the best soils. It's not like they're the best air. Fertility. Water content. They're exposed to a lot of heat from surrounding build. They're the urban heat island. They're all dealing with all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. It's pretty amazing, but also devastating.
Yeah.
So if I could ask kind of a related question that also shifts gears a little bit, has your research on forests and modeling the climate, has it kind of come to any conclusions about best practices about trying to mitigate climate change? Or, I know you had some papers where you showed that having forest cover is good because it kind of blocks, reflects some of the light back into space, or it kind of can produce more local humidity, and then that may impact local rainfall, things like that.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a tough question, and I wrote a whole book on that.
Uh,
That one of my latest book was just on that sort of topic. Is there's a lot of interest in using in what's called natural climate solutions. And the idea is that by managing ecosystems, we may be able to help mitigate climate change. And a lot of it is geared around the idea of carbon storage. Yeah, so the best way to mitigate and alleviate the climate problem is to reduce the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And one way of doing that is to managing the ecosystems to store more carbon. And then that's where forests come in because forests obviously have a lot of carbon in them, in the trees and in the soils. And so there's a lot of interest scientifically, and I would say even sort of uh, politically, but then also just sort of publicly about can we use forests and other ecosystems as a way of helping to solve the climate problem. And the thing is, it's not, and it's a very complex issue because it's not just a matter of how much carbon the forests store, but they do other things too. They evaporate water, which is really good because that actually cools down the surface climate. So that's a good thing. But they actually absorb a lot of solar radiation, and the absorbed solar radiation, heats the surface and can warm things up. But then they also emit a lot of chemicals that become aerosols in the atmosphere that then reflect solar radiation back to space, and that's a good thing. And so it's a complex story of can we actually solve the problem, or for how do forests affect climate is a complex science, and then can we actually manage forests to solve the climate problem is even more complex, both socially and politically and scientifically. And as a forest ecologist, I'd love to say yes, forests are our solution. I don't know if that's completely uh, true. What I can say is if we mismanage our forests, the climate problem will only be worse. And the
Mhm.
solutions we have to do to solve the climate problem will be even only more draconian in nature. So
Mm.
forests are part of the solution, but the exact ways of doing that are very complex, and how to actually manage them to improve climate. I will also say it's also a very old problem. There's
Mm.
been 500 years of history of people wanting to manage climate through forests. It's not a modern day discovery. It's a very old idea that forests should be managed to improve climate. Unfortunately, the original idea was that deforesting the world would actually make climate better. And then they realized that wasn't the right thing. And then it became more about reforesting the world to improve climate. But there's been a lot of historical interest in managing climate through forests.
Hmm. That's really interesting in regards of where's the happy medium, right? And how do we find it?
Yeah.
Today's episode was recorded, edited, and produced by Ryan Houston, Kevin Ferris, and Kelly Louie. To find out more and see pictures relevant to today's topic or sponsors, see the show notes linked in the description or at bonsaitimepodcast.com. To submit questions, suggestions, or tree pictures for future discussion, find the contact form also on our website or message us directly at bonsaitimepodcast@gmail.com. If you would like to support us in making more episodes, consider rating us, sharing with friends, donating, or becoming a sponsor. Our music was provided by Mini Cancer. To find more of their work, check out their SoundCloud and Bandcamp pages. To stay in touch with us, subscribe to us in your podcast app or find us on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook at Bonsai Time Podcast or on TikTok at Bonsai Time Pod. Also, Kevin and Kelly are at Kevin_FerrisPNW and Bonsai with Kelly, respectively, on Instagram. And Ryan is invivobonsai.com and on all social media. Remember, have fun and bonsai on.